Yeah, so thank you guys for coming out. It is great to see so many people here, and also thank you to our Moss Landing Marine Lab hosts as well for having us. As you know, we're here to talk about local policy, and so before introducing our esteemed panel, I'm going to, and then launching into the broader discussion, I'm going to start with a short 30,000-foot view of some of the what's, whys, and how's of local policy. And to do this, I'm going to use the macro issue of climate change as a mini case study, a very brief case study, to just show and think about how big issues like that can cut across the sort of multiple aspects of policymaking from the national level, which we are actually going to be pretty much ignoring today, to the local level. And so actually I wanted to say at first then what we mean by local policy. And I kind of just said it. We're talking about subnational levels. So that's going to span a fair amount of things for our purposes tonight. Much of this is local and state government policy, and I'll get to what local government is in a bit, but there's also significant policy being made all the time in the private sector, which I wanted to point out. And this includes the gradual greening of business practices, and such as the establishment of sustainability programs through big businesses, and also the role of technology and other industries in coming up with new innovations which make it easier for us to attain sustainability. And then there's also these broad spectrum of public interest non-governmental organizations, NGOs, as well as industry associations, and all these play critical roles in the policy-making ecosystem that we're going to be talking about. And I believe some of our panelists today will be talking about the importance of the private side as well as the public side, and often private-public partnerships. So there are a great number of reasons why to be interested in sort of non-federal policy these days, and probably what immediately comes to mind is our current president, with his priorities in rolling back as much of the sort of environmental policy progress of the last few decades. And I don't want to sugarcoat it, it's bad, you know. It's hard to even keep track of all the things he's been rolling back. It's a distraction game, perhaps. And it seems like it's only a matter of time before some of the environmental protection, environmental health, and environmental safety rollbacks cause some real harms, either to nature or to people. But it's also important to keep in mind that there have been problems in Washington predating the current administration. So during the Obama administration, for example, for most of that period, the administration was relatively limited to making policy through executive orders or through regulatory action, rules and regulations through the agencies. There was a congressional climate which basically thwarted significant changes in climate and other issues. So fortunately, we're in a different situation in California, is kind of the good news. We're a particularly large and influential state. We make up about 12% of the population and 14% of the gross domestic product. Internationally, our economy would rank as sixth place, more or less, if we were among nations, if we were a nation. So we're about the size economically as France. That said, we're also a large and very diverse state, and we have a lot of our own problems too. So I don't want to have the rose-tinted glasses on for too long. So there's environmental challenges, and there are also serious environmental justice issues that the state is grappling with. So I said I'm going to focus on the macro issue of climate change to kind of as a mini case study. And California has increasingly become a global player in that sphere. California has actually a long environmental legacy, starting in the 70s, where we tried to clean up air quality and we tried to become more efficient with energy, and all that kind of led to 2005, 2006, when we got our first sort of explicit climate legislation, I guess. First an executive order, actually, and then a bill that codified that and authorized some of the agency actions, where we set the target to reduce our emissions of greenhouse gases to the 1990 levels by 2020. And since then, we've been building on that. And so this kind of stands in contrast to the federal situation. And as the Trump administration has sort of shrunk back from climate action at the global level, California has sort of been rising up, filling that void. And a lot of that credit is due to the governor, Jerry Brown, who has mobilized several different international and national international and domestic subnational coalitions. So on the international front, for example, several years ago, there was what was called the Under 2 MOU, or the Under 2 Coalition, who signed that MOU. More recently, there's been the International Alliance to Combat Ocean Acidification, or OA Alliance, and that started as a partnership among the West Coast governors, California, Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia, and has now expanded to international membership. And then most recently, just a couple of weeks ago at the UN Climate Change Conference in Bonn, Germany, Governor Brown and former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg, who is now the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy for Cities and Climate Change, released the America's Pledge report at the US Climate Action Pavilion, which was sponsored actually by a non-federal US group of people. So again, there's this shadow, these people are filling this void left by the Trump administration in a shadow government sort of way and running with it. So this report documents the scope and scale of subnational climate action in the US. To date, it includes 20 states and territories, 110 cities, over 1,400 businesses with US operations, about 600 universities, and a number of tribes, which collectively represent more than 50% of the country's population and economy. And they've all adopted quantified emissions reduction targets. So from the city level to the state level, and even sovereign nations of tribes. So if this collective was a country, it would be the third largest economy in the world after US and China. So the point is there's substantial activity happening at all these levels, and that's cause for some hope. The Trump officials remain the official US representatives to these international climate conferences, but as I mentioned, America's Pledge has reportedly been acting as the shadow party within the negotiations, and there has been some lobbying to actually get this organization officially recognized. As Michael Bloomberg said in some of the press releases, in Paris, the US pledged to measure and report our progress reducing emissions alongside every other nation. Through America's Pledge, we're doing just that, and we're going to continue to uphold our end of the deal with or without Washington. So that's kind of the resistance language that's coming out there. And we do need, this is not to say we don't need federal action to meet the challenge of climate change. And ideally, we need leadership, federal leadership. But this multi-level discussion about climate change illustrates the potential for interactions between the international, national, and local levels, which all tend to play complementary roles then. So how do these interactions work? Well, in the climate action case, you have internationally negotiated agreements, such as the Paris Agreement. National governments have typically made pledges to that, voluntary pledges, and established broad government initiatives, which then get translated into mechanisms like new agency rules and regulations, tax incentives, other funding opportunities. And then it's largely left to the state and local programs to run with these legal mandates and incentives and design and implement new programs, particularly in those areas where they have particular jurisdictions. And there's similar relationships between the state level and local level too, as there are at the national, state, and local. So what are these local jurisdictions, and what do they do that the feds don't? So by local, I'm referring to counties, cities, school districts, other special districts, such as air quality districts, transportation authorities, those sorts of entities. You're probably familiar with some of the spatial partitioning that the federal government does with states. For example, we have federal waters and we have state waters, and there's federal lands, national forests, Bureau of Land Management, et cetera, that we have state lands. There's local lands. So we partition responsibilities spatially that way, but we also partition them across issues. So land use planning, zoning, urban planning, transportation, public health, waste management, education, drinking water systems, water quality, air quality, et cetera. Those tend to be managed at some local level, but according to higher level mandates and oversight. So those are sort of where policies, the rubber hits the road with respect to a lot of our government issues. Other state mandates or incentives may target utilities, developers, manufacturers, agriculture, or other important sectors of the economy. And the interesting thing then about climate change mitigation and adaptation is it touches all these different issues in various ways, and it's forcing all levels of government and the private sector to think about how to do things better, smarter, and less carbon intensively. So for this reason, I think climate change provides a great example of how these policy issues intersect with the different levels, but it's by no means the only macro issue that we could be talking about this way. There's all sorts of other natural resource management and social services and whatnot sort of could be discussed similarly. So one of the biggest challenges then, I'm about to wrap this up and turn it over to introducing the panelists, but one of the biggest challenges often seems to be making the connections then between these different levels as seamless as possible. Policy making, the policy making arena, I think of somewhat analogously to an ecosystem. There's lots of players, there's complex interrelationships between these players. Ideally, many of those relationships are facilitative or mutualistic. They're not always that way. But the important point is that you have to sort of grapple with that complexity, and you have to figure out how to make the connections between the different essential actors as smooth as possible. So after that especially geeky note, I am going to now introduce our panelists. I won't make them tell us which part of the ecosystem they are, but I'll introduce them, and then I've given them a couple guiding questions, which I'll tell you now, but I'll probably repeat them again. And that's just basically what were their individual paths into the realm, and how would they encourage others, depending on individual interests and sort of personality type and whatnot, to think about getting more involved in policy. So what are the entry points and the many ways of interacting in the policy arena? So in terms of introductions, we're doing it in the order of height. So, I'm going to introduce Erin Eastwood first.
I have heels on, so I don't know.
Erin is the Ocean Policy Specialist for the Monterey Bay Aquarium's Ocean Conservation Policy Program, where she works on policy issues at the local, state, and federal levels related to the aquarium's conservation goals. She started her career as a conservation scientist. During her master's work at Columbia University, she conducted population genetics research on fisheries species to inform MPA network design in Fiji. And because I happen to have been a reader on our thesis committee, I know it was fabulous work. Erin also contributed to the development of a marine resources management strategy for a town in the Dominican Republic, and conducted GIS spatial analyses for a series of tropical forest conservation projects. She's equally committed to science communications. She volunteered for the Society for Conservation Biology as their social media editor, where she tweeted about articles in the Society's flagship journal, Conservation Biology. Also taught authors how to personally tweet about their own research. She's developed a number of science lessons through TED Ed. And after a master's, Erin went on as the New York Sea Grant's 2016 Johna Canals. It is pronounced Canals, right?
Yeah, hard K.
Marine Policy Fellow to serve with NOAA Research's Climate Program Office, where she helped coordinate and lead NOAA's international domestic blue carbon activities and helped strengthen and facilitate international climate-related partnerships. She's a native of Southern California. She did her undergraduate degree at Loyola Marymount before moving to the East Coast then, and I know she's very happy to be back in California now and working with Aquarium. Next tallest is Dr. Don Crowell. Don's a professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at UCSC, where he runs the Coastal Conservation Action Lab. He's conducted research on island ecosystems and marine vertebrates for over 30 years, has published over 100 papers with individually and with collaborators. The work's informed a number of policy decisions, including a ban on commercial fishing for krill in U.S. federal waters, the closure of California gillnet fisheries, the listing of several manta ray species under CITES, and the establishment of protected islands in Mexico. He's also known for his commitment to teaching field-based natural history and research methods, including an amazing intensive full-load super course that spends much of the quarter visiting and doing short research projects across multiple sites in the UC's natural reserve system, for which Don is also a faculty director, or the faculty director. Stepping outside academia, in 1994, he co-founded the conservation NGO Island Conservation, whose mission is to eradicate invasive alien species on islands and therefore help restore threatened island biodiversity, particularly seabirds. Island Conservation originally focused on Baja California, but has expanded their work across the Caribbean, South America, the Hawaiian Islands, the Aleutian Islands, and other sites in the Pacific. So it's definitely a success story. He's also a founding partner of Conservation Metrics, a for-profit conservation consulting business focused on using acoustic methods to efficiently monitor seabirds. Don is a proud product of the California's public university systems, attending UC Davis for his undergraduate degree, then coming here to Moss Landing Marine Labs for his master's degree, and then Scripps Institution of Oceanography for his PhD. Last, he's a resident of the small community of Davenport, just north of Santa Cruz. And if he weren't here tonight, he'd be at the Vision Santa Cruz County public meeting being held in Santa Cruz tonight. So,
My wife is there.
Yeah. But I also think it's worth mentioning that just about every time I'm lucky enough to visit Davenport Landing, which is this fairly secluded beach with a great intertidal zone, I run across Don coming out of the water in a wetsuit with his surfboard or hanging out on the beach with his family and friends. So he takes advantage of where he lives, which I appreciate. So, and then the tallest member of our panel is Assemblyman Mark Stone. Mark was elected in 2012. He's in his third term representing California Assembly District 29, which includes portions of Santa Cruz, Santa Clara, and Monterey counties. He has a heavy load of standing committees, including being chair of the Assembly Judiciary, member of the Banking and Finance Committee, member of the Budget Committee, member of the Human Services Committee, and member of the Natural Resources Committee. He's also chair of the Select Committee on Coastal Protection and Access to Natural Resources, and is a member of the Select Committee on Waste Reduction and Recycling in the 21st Century, California. And he's co-chair of the California Environmental Legislative Caucus. So he has a lot of bona fides in the environmental world. He's also the Assembly Speaker's appointment to the Ocean Protection Council, which is the state entity charged with maintaining healthy, resilient, and productive ocean and coastal ecosystems for the state. Beyond the environment, though, he also has other signature issues, including working on behalf of vulnerable groups, such as foster youth, LGBT plus individuals, immigrants, and as I said, other vulnerable members of society. And sort of towards that end, he's a member of the select committees on end-of-life healthcare, foster care, status of boys and men of color, as well as cybersecurity. So previous to becoming an Assembly member, he served 2 terms as Santa Cruz County Supervisor, and while there he held leadership roles on the Santa Cruz County Regional Transportation Commission and the First 5 Commission. Mark also led an overhaul of the Santa Cruz County Child Welfare System, and he also spearheaded the successful effort to ban single-use plastic bags in Santa Cruz County, and served as vice chair of the California Coastal Commission. And then before that, he was trustee of the Scotts Valley Unified School District, including being elected president. So Mark was born in Santa Barbara, attended college at UC Berkeley, and then earned a law degree at Santa Clara University. Before entering public service, he worked as an attorney in the tech industry and as a professor at the Naval Postgraduate School. So essentially, my conclusion is that Mark has checked all the boxes, including academia, the private business sector, and multiple levels of government. So we're very fortunate to have him here, as well as our other panelists tonight. So maybe give him a big round of applause to start with. So let's go in the same order of height. And just, if amplify what I said about your intro or refute it, or just tell us a little bit more about yourself and maybe a story about how you got interested and on your policy track, and then if you have other suggestions for how people explore this.
Great, yeah. Thanks so much, Dan, for that intro, and to Maureen and COS folks for inviting me to participate. It's really awesome to be on this panel with really distinguished panelists. So Dan gave a great intro of basically the whole background of how I got to where I am here at the Monterey Bay Aquarium as the ocean policy specialist. I really did come from a scientific background, so I got my biology degree, undergrad, and then conservation biology degree in my master's. But I was always really interested in applied science and pursuing research projects and answering questions that could hopefully try to solve some problem, right? So a lot of my work in grad school didn't just have to do with the research, it also had to do with kind of translating those results to who might be interested in them. And a lot of that was communication work, whether it's to the public or specific interested decision makers. So that's kind of how I got my interest and knowledge of a little bit more of policy issues. Just policy as a whole started to interest me the more I started to work on these types of problems like climate change and fisheries issues. And so after grad school, I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to be a Canals Fellow. And I'm obviously an early career person on this panel, so I will tell you.
You look like you're
No.
Hey, Erin,
Like,
we went by
in
height.
awe of these people next to me. But I would highly advocate, because I was really in your guys' seat 3 years ago, and would advocate looking into these fellowships if you're interested in, or opportunities to basically place scientists or environmental professionals in a government or public policy situation. So you really get an understanding of kind of what goes into decision making. So a lot more that I've learned through that experience than I had previously known. So that's all I'll say at the moment about my background, I guess. And I'll, in the sake of time, get to the answer or the question of how to get involved in local policy. And so when I was thinking about this, like pieces of advice to give folks, for me, it's kind of a combo of my personal experiences as well as my experience working at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, which is a science-based NGO. And we really try to inform our policy work on a foundation of really credible peer-reviewed science. So the first piece of advice I would say is before you even go about trying to do public policy engagement, like go to a city council meeting and put in public comment or write a letter or talk to your representative, I would advise just taking a step back and really trying to get a sense of that ecosystem that Dan mentioned. there's a lot going on with ocean issues, as you all know, and it's really helpful to, when you're coming to your representative with an ask or even just to offer resources, it's really helpful to have that understanding of the broader context and overlay your science or whatever your expertise is onto that broader picture of the economics, whatever the opposition's perspective is. Just understanding the broader kind of ecosystem is, I think, incredibly helpful in being an effective communicator. And it helps, like, be open, you know, it's cool to get other people's perspectives, and sometimes your mind will be changed, which is interesting. And the second piece is really just, again, getting to communication, trying to be an effective communicator to different audiences. And I'm sure you guys have heard a lot about that from the Marine Network, because I know that's a priority of this group, which is great. And then third, and from my NGO perspective, I think a lot of people, when you think about policy work, you may think it's, you as a constituent or you as a scientist having a one-on-one to, either a city council member or, being an individual coming to your representative to speak about an issue. But I would also advocate for the really worthwhile avenue of trying to be part of a collective voice. So there's tons of organizations out there that are really great at helping interested people get involved in policy work, train you up and figure out what it is your message is. And representatives and Assemblymember Stone can speak to this, have thousands of constituents and want to listen to them all. And it's obviously very difficult. I think you're kind of an exception to the rule in that you listen to individuals often, but being part of a group basically is another very effective and worthwhile thing to explore. So happy to discuss more of that after the breakout session. That's all I'll say for now.
I guess I'm next highest. Well, congratulations to all you guys for being here, because when I was a graduate student at Moss Landing, this didn't exist, and this is really a cool thing. For no other reason that you get to meet everybody across the bay and what they're doing, and I think that's really an awesome thing. But also, I think it's giving you guys the opportunity to start off on that pathway, which is how do you get involved? And I'm going to ask you guys a couple of questions. How many of you are natural scientists in the room? And by natural scientists, I mean you study ecology or taxonomy. How many of you are social scientists? That's what I suspected. How many of you want to save the world, or at least leave it better than you found it? That's also what I thought. So when I was a graduate student, academics did their thing, they did their research, and policy people did their thing. And basically you were contaminated goods if you got involved in policy. You were biased, you were basically thought of as really not a bona fide scientist. And that bothered me a lot. And so what I would say is that you guys have a lot to offer. So even if you're not a social scientist, as a natural scientist, you have a lot to offer, but you have to do some work. And so what I would encourage you to do is exactly what Erin was saying. First of all, involve yourself in the whole ecosystem, not just the part that you're studying, but all the stuff that goes around it, especially if you want to save the world, where you're not going to get animals to do something different, you're going to get people to do something different. And so you have to understand where the levers are, where the catalysts are, and how you can get involved. The other thing too is, I'm assuming all of you are passionate about something. I mean, what brought you here, or what brought you into your careers is that you were passionate about something about the world, and oftentimes that's the natural world. Understand your passions and figure out, because a passionate person is going to be much more effective than a dispassionate person. And so understand your passions, understand where your passions and where your expertise can actually lend itself to policy, understand the ecosystem of how policy is enacted, and get involved. And by that, start small. One of the things that Dan didn't say about me, because you can't find it on the web, is that I'm also on the board of the school board of Pacific School, and I'm also a member of the Davenport North Coast Association, which is kind of a quasi-elected neighborhood kind of organization in the North Coast. That's because I love where I live, and a lot happens. The things that affect your life the most happen at the local level. it's what the decisions that the city councils, the board of supervisors are making, first and foremost, affects why did they build that damn house there? Well, it's because of zoning regulations those were decisions that are made at the county level. They're not made, Donald Trump has nothing to do with that house. And so understanding how that works, understanding how local politics work, and get involved, because there's all kinds of avenues for doing that. And Mark knows a lot more about that because he's been at all these different levels. I've been at the school board level, and I've been involved with trying to work at the county level. So I do a lot of work with the county. And what I do is try to figure out where my expertise can lend a hand. So I'm a biologist. I know about endangered species. So right now, the big deal in Davenport is, what are they going to do with the cement plant in Davenport? Is there enough water? What does that mean for salmon? So those are places that I feel like all of a sudden I have something to add to the conversation, but I have to know about the greater ecosystem of where I'm working. So I would just say that don't be shy to get involved. And a lot of the most important decisions are made at really boring meetings. Mark probably knows more about boring meetings than many of us here. But understanding when they're getting ready to revise the local coastal plan, get involved, because that's going to affect your community the most, say in California, coastal California. So those are the things. Inform yourself about how the coastal commission works. How does the county government work? How do those two things work together? That's just for California as an example, but wherever you are, whether you're in the US or in another country. I've worked a lot in Mexico, and it's a different ecosystem, but if I'm going to get a marine protected area established in Mexico, I need to understand how that ecosystem works. And so all I would say is that getting involved, understanding where your expertise is and where it can be informative, and listen to all the different players. If you're working on a fisheries issue, don't just worry about how many fish there are, but who wants to catch those fish, and what are their constraints, and what are their socioeconomic values. Those are all important things to know. So with that, that's my suggestion to you, is get involved, start locally, work on your passions, and don't be afraid to use your science to get involved in policy.
Well, if you were paying attention, you noticed when these two were introduced, it was a long list of accomplishments. When I was introduced, it's a long list of titles. Because the policy world is very different, ultimately, than the science world. And I've had the opportunity to talk about that, and it's kind of fun. I try not to get too snarky or too cynical, and I don't want you to be cynical about it. But it's an interesting process. I ran a resolution just this last year in the state legislature, and a resolution's not a bill, doesn't become a law, it's just a statement of something. And the statement was basically, we think science is valuable, and we think policy should be informed by science. There were people who voted no. And one person stood up and challenged me and said, this is just a veiled attempt to go after the federal administration. And I said, oh, I'm sorry. If you thought this was a veiled attempt to go after the administration, I have to apologize. And let me lift the veil, because there's no veil. Because that's what, because of that level of stupidity. But we, as policymakers, and I got into this, I was an attorney practicing in the tech industry, got on a school board because my kids were little, and I wanted to do more than PTA. And I don't know how I got here. I was sort of at the right place at the right time at a number of decision points. But really anybody can do this, and something that I say a lot, and this is being recorded, this is going to get me in trouble one of these days, but we're not the best and the brightest as policymakers. We're just those who get elected. You're the best and the brightest. And if you think you can take something that you've sweated over and proven and had other academics approve it and it's written up, and you can just take that and take it to a policymaker and say, this is so clear that this is what the policy should be. If you think that's going to drive the decision, then start over again. Because if the science supports what I want to accomplish as a policymaker, then I love science. If it doesn't, I know this sounds crazy, but I can discount it in the world that I live in the world that I operate in. And I like the policy part of what I do, but this is politics, and politics is just relationships, really. I hate the politics part of this, but You got to do politics to get to this. And the advice is very, very sound. I was just out today, spent most of the day, we were looking at projects dealing with transportation projects and the Highway 1. And it's about climate change adaptation and sea level rise. And looking at transportation projects and how they're going to be resilient. And it was here at Elkhorn Slough, because there have been a number of Caltrans projects to benefit the slough. And then down in the Carmel Valley, because there's another bridge that goes across the Carmel River that impedes a lagoon, and trying to find a way to protect against floods and flood damage, which happens down there quite a bit, but also open up that floodway. And so who was all there? There were folks from the Federal Highway Administration, from Caltrans, from the county, from Big Sur Land Trust, from the Coastal Commission, the Coastal Conservancy, and the Nature Conservancy was the one who put this on. Now, a lot of those, the Nature Conservancy is just a group people belong to. Others are places where people work at. There were planners from the county and planners from Caltrans. Any number of folks involved in looking at this. Of course, how we did it is we had to get in kayaks and go up Elkhorn Slough for a couple hours. And then in the Carmel Valley, hike up to a point so we could look down. So it was a lovely day in the sun and doing things. But it was a number of different organizations and different people throughout that spectrum of federal, state, and local who are working to solve a very particular problem. And when it comes to climate change, and this is one of the things we were dealing with there, the answers, and California's done a good job. You talk about the things California's done and what Jerry Brown represents internationally is we've done a good job of mitigation and coming up with mitigation plans. What we have not done very well is adaptation, is adapting to the changing climate. Things like sea level rise. That's what this discussion was about. But when you're having to tell a private property owner, no, that house is going to fall into the ocean because that bluff is retreating, because that's what bluffs do. Or there's a sewer lift station or a water treatment plant that's in a floodplain, like at the base of the Carmel River. What are you going to do when the seas come up and you get a large storm event that's coming down? How do you prepare for that? Well, those are very, very difficult decisions and almost impossible to do at a local level. And with state intervention, I won't say federal intervention because we don't want them playing here now, but there are ways to try and push good decision-making down at the local level. But if I'm a city council member and I have to go to my neighbors and get them to vote for me and help fund my campaign, then I can't be telling some of them, I don't care about your house. Of course, I'm going to say, we're going to do everything we can to protect what you own in your little part of the world. Well, but is that what we need to be doing if we're really trying to protect California and build resilience in California? Those are not necessarily compatible notions. And so the impact of any decision is different at those different levels. And one of the reasons I went to the state was as a local elected on the County Board of Supervisors, I was very frustrated with some of the things the state was doing or not doing. So I ended up at the state, hopefully not doing the same thing to counties and cities, but trying to fix some of those things at the state level that were impacting the locals. And one of the things that I don't know how to do yet, I don't think anybody knows how to do, is to translate this notion of resilience and adaptation down to the local level in a way that they can be successful. The best opportunities through the Coastal Commission, because the California Coastal Commission has, in this state, original jurisdiction in the coastal zone. We're in the coastal zone here. And so they have this hammer they can impose on local jurisdictions, and that's something that actually works well. Several times this happened when I was a commissioner, where a city council member would stand in public comment or comment and berate us. Don't you dare make this decision. You can't do this. This is killing my constituents. This is hurting the city. You will not do this. And then at some party later on would come up and say, thank you, because I couldn't do that. In my political reality, I couldn't do that. But they knew, and this happened several times, they knew what the right answer was. So as a scientist, you can do the research, you can have it peer reviewed, you can do everything, you know what's right. In the political world, it's not always what's right, it's what you can get done within the context of the relationships. But it also can work. And if we're doing policy that's informed by science and figuring out how to communicate better and work better together, then we do get better policy that way, as opposed to policies that ignore the science and have gotten us into a lot of the problems that we're facing right now. Because California's land use policy, for example, that dates back to the 40s and the 50s, is part of the problem that we're having to undo in order to build a more resilient California, and well as be able to have you afford to live here at some point in your life, if that's ever going to be possible. And that's been because of the long string of implications over time. And so finding a way to get involved, getting to know individuals, working in the policy realm. There are fellowships, there are science fellowships, there are a number of different ways to directly engage, or working with a local group, people who are like-minded and are working towards a specific goal, becoming engaged in that, becoming a voice for that, and building some of that credibility so that when it comes to that relationship of asking someone to change their mind, to run some policy, to prevent policy from coming that may be harmful, you have a basis to have that conversation. And that's what it often is building a basis to have the conversation and building your own credibility to be in the room and be a part of the conversation.